I hope everyone had a lovely Purim, and we're ready to start a new chapter in the Shulchan Aruch Harav, because we finished the laws of Bal Tashchis. This was an unusual chapter, the chapter of Nizkei Adam, how to protect yourself from bodily harm, because it included a lot of really unusual halachos that bordered on mysticism and things like that. We were also left with a lot of gray area in the laws of Bal Tashchis. We were left with laws of gray area as far as when we should or should not be concerned about shadim. But at least we've raised awareness about these matters. Okay, now, Dine She'ela Usechirus V'chasima. Siman Yud Aleph deals with three topics. She'ela, which is borrowing. Sechirus is renting or leasing. And chasima is muzzling. Now, why those are all in the same category, we certainly understand the first two being part of the same category. Chasima is the prohibition to muzzle an animal. And perhaps it's related because typically people would borrow or lease animals, and you have to know the proper way to treat the animal. So we'll deal with that at the end of the chapter, but there's 30 paragraphs in this chapter. So she'ela here specifically refers to chattel, and so therefore the paragraph opens as follows. Hashoel o hasocher behema o metaltalin. If you borrow or rent an animal or any kind of chattel, any kind of movable object, eno rashai lo lahashilam v'lo lihaskiram la'acher shalom mida'as ba'olim. You are not allowed to lend them out or to rent them out to anyone else without consent of the owner. That's a very clear-cut black and white halacha. Refreshing, right, to get just the black and white halacha. Afilu sfarim sheyesh mitzvah b'she'elasam. Now this is true even to holy books, where we would say, well, there's a mitzvah to lend out holy books and to share them with others. Ein omrim min hastam noach leba'olim shete'asa mitzvah b'mamona. We do not say that we can assume that the owner would be happy to have a mitzvah to be done with his property. Of course, I just borrowed this new chumash from my friend with Rabbi Sachs's commentary, and my other friend wants to see it also. I can't imagine that Yankel, who lent me the new chumash, would be in any way, wouldn't want to share it with as many people as possible. You can't make that assumption. And the reason is, ki shema ein ritzonam sheyehi pikdonam biyad acher, she'eino neman be'einehem kazeh. And the reason is because whenever a person lends out an item of value, he makes a calculus. And his calculus is, how much do I trust the person that I'm lending this object to? Obviously part of the calculus is to take into account the value of the object that I'm lending, its fragility, how easily it can be damaged, and how much do I trust the person that I'm lending it to. So it's very possible that the Yankel who owns the sefer or who owns whatever other object we're dealing with only trusts me with that object of value, but doesn't trust somebody else. Afilu hu kal shebekalim v'hasheni adir sheba adirim. And that's true even if objectively in the eyes of the community, I, the guy that Yankel lent the sefer to, is the lightest. I'm a lightweight, right? And the guy who asked to borrow it from me is a heavyweight as far as being very respected and a noble person within the community. Doesn't matter. it could very well be that Yankel, who owns the Sefer, has a special view of me that other people don't have, and he only trusts me. So I don't have a right to take liberties with property that does not belong to me and that is only on loan to me and lend it out to others. The usr lahavir al ritzon habalim, and it is usr to violate the wishes of the owner. Okay, so fine. So that's pretty straightforward. He says, the im darkam. Let me turn the page. Well, you have the PDF. Let me just see. The im darkam. Sorry, my mouse isn't with me today, so. Am I allowed? Are you allowed to make copies of the book? That's an interesting question. That certainly is not a question of violating what was lent to me. It's a question of, am I violating copyright law? So that's a different shaila. Let's finish this halacha. He says, "V'im darkam lahamid tamid lahasheni davar rashum kazeh mutar." If, however, Yankel, who is the book owner, typically lends out books both to me and to the other guy who's asking to borrow the Sefer, and there's already been an established pattern that he trusts both of us, or perhaps he has a lending library where it's known that he regularly lends out books to everyone in the community, and it's the same kind of commodity that he would normally lend out to the other guy as well, then it's mutar. Then it would be permitted for me to lend it out to the third party. Uvilvad shelo yimat b'shmiraso, provided that the third party will not in any way diminish the level of guardianship. Now, what does he mean by that? So he's going to give us an illustration. Kagon, imhu shaul biyado, rashai lahash ilolo, velo lahaskiro. So, for example, you're dealing with, well, we'll say Yankel is the Sefer owner, and then we have Ruvain and Shimon, who are the borrowers. So Ruvain borrowed the Sefer from Yankel, and Shimon is now asking if he can borrow it as well. And Shimon says, and Ruvain knows this for a fact, it's not just he's taking Shimon's word for it. Ruvain knows that Yankel always lends his Sfarim to Shimon as well. So Ruvain has a right then to lend it to Shimon as well, provided that he doesn't diminish the level of responsibility. And what he means by here is that there's a different level of responsibility between a borrower and a renter. What do we mean by that? When I borrow something from you and I'm not paying you for the object that I'm borrowing, my level of responsibility is minimal as far as the amount of protective care that I have to take to your is maximal, I should say, regarding the amount of care that I have to take to your property, which means that I'm responsible for anything that happens to your property, even if it's what's called an onus, even if the house burns down, and it had nothing to do with me because the house was struck by lightning. It was an act of God, okay? And your book happened to be inside the house when it burnt down. I'm liable for the destruction of your book. But if I'm a renter of your book, so then my liability levels are reduced. I'm still liable for theft and loss, but I'm not liable for acts of God. I'm not liable for things that happen completely by accident.
So you're liable for negligence.
Well, no, negligence, there's three levels. Negligence is the lowest level that everyone is liable for, okay? Even when I'm doing you a favor and watching your book for you, that's what's called pshia in terms of the Gemara. Then there's a middle level called Gineva Va'aveda, which is theft and loss. That's not when something gets stolen from my house, it's not negligence that it got stolen as long as my doors were locked. But it's not exactly a complete mishap, because if I wanted to, I could have appointed a 24-hour security guard over your book, right? So it's not a complete mishap. Okay, and then we have something called ones, which is the highest level, and that's where there was nothing that imaginable that I could have done to foresee this kind of mishap occurring. So let me just finish the point. So if Reuven has borrowed the book, he has to, and he knows that Shimon also has the right to borrow Yankel's books, he's allowed to lend the book to Shimon, but he cannot rent the book to Shimon, because by renting the book to Shimon, he has lowered Shimon's level of liability from what it was originally lent for. That's the point. Go ahead, Martin.
When you rent a car, you have a contract. Somebody borrow you a car, have a small scratch, sorry. It's no, well, maybe it's maybe it's a commitment, but it's not a legal commitment. So.
You should know that when you borrow someone's car, you're halachically obligated in all accidents. You're halachically obligated. Now, the fact that the guy may have an insurance policy means that he is working under the assumption that if there's damage to the car, his insurance will cover it. But what happens if he tells you, I don't feel comfortable going to my insurance company for a fender bender because they're going to raise my premiums and I'd rather just pay it out of pocket? Then you, the borrower, have a responsibility to pay for it. You can't say, oh, just take it out of your insurance. He says, no, I don't want to take it out of my insurance. They're going to raise my premiums. So he has a right to take you to Beis Din and say, you have to pay. You borrowed my car. Now, borrowing has the highest level of liability because you're getting full benefit and you're not giving anything in return. If someone rents a car, they have limited liability. Why? For very good reason, because they're a renter. So it depends on the type of insurance policy you pull out together with the car. Some require you to have insurance, some don't require you to have insurance, but they can stipulate whatever deal that they want because they make the stipulations of the rental. But from a strictly halachic point of view, if we were to govern car rentals on halacha, so then you would be liable only for theft and negligence, but you wouldn't be liable if a complete accident happens, like you park your car in a Walmart parking lot and someone rams into it. That's not something, that's called onus. That's not something that you're liable for. The rental car company may hold you liable because that's in their contract, but halachically, you're not liable for it. But once you sign the contract, you do become liable because you're agreeing to the terms. In other words, any two parties can make any stipulation financially that they wish to make. Okay, so anyway, so that's the point that we're saying over here. So you have to maintain the same level of liability from between Reuven and Shimon in order for it to be permissible to lend out the book. Shahashoel, I'm sorry again about the turning of the page. Shahashoel chayiv ba'onsin v'hasocher pater, because a shoel is liable for all mishaps, whereas a renter is exempt from absolute mishaps, absolute onus. The imhu muskar biyado rashai lahashilo ulahaskiro avolo lahafkido sheyishmerenu bechinam. Now let's go to another illustration. Let's say Reuven has rented an object from Yankel. So Yankel has a new sefer, and he's willing to rent it out to Ruvain for a week. And he says, I'll rent it to you for $5. You have a week to read the book, and then you have to give it back. And Ruvain knows that Yankel has the same policy to anyone else that wishes to take advantage of his books. So, and he does this regularly. He's got like some kind of rental library or something. So Ruvain then has license to give it over to Shimon. He can increase Shimon's level of liability, but he cannot decrease Shimon's level of liability. So how would he increase Shimon's level of liability? Lending it to Shimon for free. Because whereas Ruvain is only liable for theft, but not for mishaps, because he's a renter, if he lends it to Shimon, Shimon will now have an even higher liability than Ruvain has. That he's allowed to do. He's also allowed to do a lateral move. So just like I've rented it from Yankel, I can lease it and make Shimon give him a sub-rental. Okay? Avalola hafkida, but what can he not do? He cannot lower Shimon's level of liability. Now, how do you lower the level of liability? No, not renting it. Renting would be lateral. By asking Shimon to do him a favor and watch the book while he goes away for a couple of days. So what is that called? When a person is asked to watch something for you for free, that's called a shomer chinam. Okay, so we all have some level of familiarity with Bava Mitzia and Bava Kama, right? So the shomer chinam is a person who does you a favor and watches your item, like, I need you to cat sit my cat, right? Or book sit my book, right? So watch over this book and hold on to it because I'm going away and no one's there to watch the book, so watch it. What is a shomer chinam's level of liability? He's certainly not liable for onus. He's not even liable for theft or loss. The only thing that he's liable for is pishia, what Paul mentioned before, which is negligence. He's liable for negligence. So, for example, if there's a Levi who, if Shimon, if Ruvain has the book, he's rented it for the week, and then Ruvain decides he needs to go out of town, and he doesn't want to leave the book all alone in his apartment because he doesn't feel it safe. So he gives it to Shimon, and he says, Shimon, do me a favor, hold on to this book. It belongs to Yankel. Shimon says, with pleasure. He leaves his house, and someone breaks in and steals the book. So that's a problem, because whereas if the same thing would have happened to Ruvain would be liable, Shimon is off the hook for that. The only thing that Shimon would be liable for is if he left the door of his apartment open when he left the house. In that scenario, if he left the front door of his house unlocked, so then he would be liable for negligence. So the reason why you cannot ask Shimon to watch it for you is because you're lowering the level of liability. And as he explains explicitly, Shahashomer Chinam Patur Migeneva, because a Shomer Chinam is exempt from responsibility for theft. A lot of commentary there.
So if Shimon said to Levi, I'll pay you to watch this.
And for loss. Yeah. Let me just finish, Paul.
I'm sorry, Rabbi.
Imlo Pasha b'shmiraso v'hasocher chayav. Unless Shimon was negligent in his guardianship, then and only then would Shimon be liable. Whereas v'hasocher chayav, whereas a socher, a renter, is liable for theft and loss. Go ahead, Paul.
I was just wondering if Shimon said to Levi, I'll pay you to watch it on my behalf for the weekend that I'm gone, then would he be at the same level and then that would be all right?
Yes, exactly. So what you're describing Reuven asks Shimon to watch the book and he offers to pay him, then Shimon becomes what's called a shomer sachar, a paid guard, and a paid guard is a lateral move. He has the same level of responsibility as a socher, which is Reuven in this case, and that would be okay.
Mm-hmm.
This will all become clear in the commentaries. So
Okay,
yeah.
thank you.
I will give to a store dresses on consignment.
Sure.
So they take it on consignment for a little bit of then what happens is dresses not. And so and all of a sudden there's on let's say on the dress right off. And, so is it the responsibility of the store to go after the payment for that or for the cleaning or whatever else it is, or do they go to the customer and the customer could say it wasn't my lipstick? I don't know.
That's a great question. First of all, I would be fascinated to pick your brain about this phenomenon that happens in society, that people buy a dress. A woman will buy a dress because she has a wedding that night. She'll wear the dress and then return it the next day. How often does that happen? Is that a common? Doesn't
Online.
Online, really?
People don't buy in stores and then the policy you can return it in 30 days and use it and return it. Even for in Home Depot, it happens a lot with tools. You need a specific tool to do a small job. You will never use this tool again. And they told me, actually, the guy from Home Depot told me, buy it, use it, and return it. I can't do that. Yeah.
It's actual theft. Yeah, it is a form of theft. Yeah.
Yeah, but the same guy actually from the store told me to do it. You do it.
That's where the packaging and the tags and everything have to be. They're getting much more clever with that. So that they're, you can't. If you take off the tag, then automatically, then they're not going to take it back.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So it's important to have good tag, hang tags or whatever that once they're cut off, then.
I'll make sure if I see a woman with tags on it,
I'll
know why.
Yeah,
because you put it in the back.
front, yeah.
If you put it in the back, they just put it in.
So in your scenario, the store is taking it on consignment. So the question we have to really ask ourselves is, what is the status of the store? Is the store a borrower? Is the store a guard or a paid guard? It would seem to me, and if they're a guard, are they a shomer chinam? Are they watching it for you for free? Or are they watching it for you for a fee? It would seem that in a case where a store takes something on consignment, they're standing to benefit. In other words, and you're standing to benefit. So it's hard to say that they are a borrower. They're not borrowing the dress from you because your objective in having them borrow this dress is so that you will pay them. You will make money off of that loan of the dress. So it's not clearly just a straight across the board shoel, borrower, but they're not being compensated by you to watch the item. So perhaps we would call them, could we call them a shomer chinam, watching it for free for you? That they're not doing either, because they're doing it for a personal gain, which is to sell the dress and to make money off of it. So it's a very interesting question. What is the halachic status of a store that takes a commodity on consignment from a manufacturer such as yourself and stands to profit off of displaying it in their window? What is their level of liability for theft and damage to the merchandise? I don't have an answer. I just need to think about it. Give me a couple of minutes or a couple of days, and we'll try to come up with a resolution on that issue. I'm sure it is discussed in the poskim, and we will figure it out.
Okay. Rabbi, would it not be similar to what we said about the car rental, that they would contract what their liability is?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I mean, the truth is, do you sign a contract with the consignee?
selling was basically they're buying in consignment. So they bought it, but they don't pay for it until they sell it. So it's like you have given 60 days or 30 days. So actually it's a transaction you sell to them, but in a consignment fashion. So if they sell it, good. If not, they return it to you. But if they return it with the damage, they own it, actually. The dress.
So during the time that it's in their store on consignment, are they considered the owners of the dress, or are you considered the owner of the dress?
I would say it's still my merchandise because they haven't paid me, and there is an understanding that they don't sell, they're going to return it.
But what happened if it's a fire?
No, because that's what I'm saying. Mordechai seemed to imply that it's a sale. In other words, as soon as they take possession of the merchandise, Mordechai's portraying it as it's theirs, but they have a right to return it if they don't sell it. So which one is it? We have
The
to.
invoice is really for administration purposes. Maybe that has to be clarified.
Yeah, it would be interesting to find out. I always thought that when you give something on consignment, the manufacturer maintains ownership of it and it's just on loan to me. And if once I sell it, it becomes mine.
If there's a fire on it, who's responsible for it?
That's part of the question. You know,
Yeah,
that's the question. Who's liable for loss or damage? A fire would be a case of loss or damage.
Yeah, but insurance pays to who? It's paid to the store, it's paid to the
Whoever
manufacturer.
took the insurance policy on the fire.
So normally
No,
the
it's
store.
Usually the store and the manufacturer would have it. They would both have fire. Insurance.
Now, if you take an insurance policy on a fire insurance policy on a dress and it gets destroyed off your property, will your insurance company still pay the premium? Still pay the.
Would they actually, I have to take liability on things that we manufacture. For example, if a dress would catch fire and harm somebody, there's liability with that. For me.
Oh,
Even though I sent that dress to somebody in Iowa, you know?
no, so that's liability on your product.
Right.
What I'm questioning is when you take out a fire insurance policy for damage that the company will pay you for loss if, let's say, a dress gets caught in the fire, or a whole series of dresses get caught in the fire. Like, for example, I know that we have an insurance policy on our Sifrei Torah. All Sifrei Torah that are on our premises are insured. And that's true, even if we lend them out and they're taken off premises, technically our insurance policy still covers them.
If it goes to a Shiva house.
If it goes to a Shiva house, for example, we're still covered by our insurance policy. Is that true about your dresses?
Or in our New York showroom.
Okay, but if they're in a consignee's storefront, they're not covered under your fire insurance policy?
That's the question.
Right? So if they're not, so then really the matter of insurance may not be relevant in this Shiloh. The question is, who do the dresses belong to halachically when they are in the consignee's possession before they've sold the dresses? And that's something that we have to clarify. We also have to clarify what the status of the consignee is. Is he a shomer chinam, a shomer sacher, or a shoah? There's an aspect of there's an element of each in what they're doing. Okay, we'll hold it here.